Hello. Good day, Osaka. I wish with the grace of Almighty you all are well. I'm Israt Jahan and I'm going to present on nationalism, syncretism and the enforcers of history. Okay, these are the texts that I have used as primary sources for my research: Amitav Ghosh's The Shadow Lines and In an Antique Land and Rabindranath Tagore's Nationalism. Now I am moving to the first part of my presentation. The dictionary definition for nationalism is the desire for political independence of people who feel they are historically a separate group within a country. I am putting an emphasis on historically separate group within a country, which I am going to focus in my presentation. Anthony D. Smith writes in The Theories of Nationalism, "Today, the nation, the national state, and nationalism have come to occupy the commanding heights of political elegance and political identity. The world is divided into territorial states. These can be defined as sets of autonomous, public institutions with a legitimate monopoly of coercion and extraction in a given territory, and sovereignty in relation to those outside its borders. The contemporary world is similarly divided into nations, that is, named populations possessing historic territory, shared myths and historical memories, a mass public center, a single economy and common rights and duties for all members, which are legitimated by the principles of nationalism. Nationalism itself can be defined as an ideological movement for the attainment deemed by some of its members to constitute an actual or potential nation. These are of course only working definitions, but if they are accepted as a starting point for subsequent analysis, it can be immediately apprehended that states, nations, and nationalisms do not often coincide, and in Anthony D. Smith's opinion, this is the immediate cause of so much of the conflict and turbulence that we witness throughout the world today. It is testimony to the power of the national ideal and to the global apparel of nationalism today that there is hardly a corner of the world that has not been swept by nationalist fervor and ethnic conflict. Benedict Anderson writes, "Nationality, or as one might prefer to put it in view of the world's multiple signification, nationness as well as nationalism, are cultural artifacts of a particular kind." He goes on to define the nation as an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined by its people and political ideologues, and these imaginings are fraught with incongruities. According to Ernest Gellner, men do not become nationalists from sentiment or sentimentality, atavistic or not, well-based myth-founded. They become nationalists through genuine, objective, practical necessity, however obscurely recognized. The cultural content of this social unit may change, but its boundaries as defined by these value standards needs to remain enforced in order to differentiate a we from a they. Therefore, to write the history of an ethnic group, for instance, will not consist in reconstituting its culture, because most of the cultural elements will have changed over time, but in identifying the boundaries, the criteria of belongingness that the group will have maintained and reinvented to distinguish itself from the other. Over a long period of time, the legitimizing power of individual mythic structures tends to be enhanced by fusion with other myths in a mythomoteur defining identity in relation to a specific polity. John Armstrong, page 9. The mythomoteur arouses intense effects by stressing individuals' solidarity against an alien force. There is by enhancing the salience of boundary perceptions. Page 9. National boundaries are thus made to assert a difference between self and other, frequently at a point of crisis. This leads to resentment that accompanies the sense of one's own failure onto an external scapegoat, tempts the ego to create the illusion of an enemy, a cause that can be blamed for one's own inferiority. Thus, one was thwarted not by a failure in oneself, but rather by an external evil. It can be defined as a psychological state resulting from suppressed feelings of envy and hatred, and the impossibility of satisfying these feelings. Page 15. There are 10 ideas as basic to the concept of nationalism. Number 1. The idea of a more or less defined territory. It can be owned or desired. Number 2. Common language. Number 3. Customs, manners, and literature. Number 4. Some common dominant social and economic institutions. Number 5. A sovereign government, passionately desired if absent. Number 6. Belief in common history and a common ethnic origin. Number 7. Love for the fellow nation. Number 8. Devotion to the nation. Number 9. Pride in its achievement and sorrow in its tragedies. Number 10. Indifference towards other peoples, other groups, perceived as a threat to the nation, and belief in a great future for the nation. At this stage, I am moving my discussion on to Rabindranath Tagore's nationalism. In the book Nationalism, which is a compilation of 3 lectures, Nationalism in Japan, Nationalism in the West, and Nationalism in India, Tagore claims that nationalism begets a disquisition and intolerance and othering, and the discourse of nationalism overlaps with the discourse imperialism. The imperialist nations adopt the role of the Lacanian grand other and seek to inscribe their authority unilaterally over the colonized nations. It breeds exclusivism and dogmatism through the Hegelian dichotomous logic of self's fundamental hostility towards the other. Thus every nation becomes narcissistic and considers the presence of another a threat to itself, waging war against one other nations for its self-fulfillment, and self-aggrandizement becomes a justifiable and even holy act. Nationalism, according to Tagore, is not a spontaneous self-expression of man as social being, where human relationships are naturally regulated, so that men can develop ideals of life in cooperation with one another. Page 5. But rather a political and commercial union of a group of people in which they congregate to maximize their profit, progress, and power. It is the organized self-interest of a people where it is least human and least spiritual. Page 8. Tagore argued that British colonialism found its justification in the ideology of nationalism, as the colonizer came to India and other rich pastures of the world to plunder and so further the prosperity of their own nation. Page 12. One might think that Tagore's critique of nationalism is a little lofty and far-fetched, too pious, as Pound might have said. His arguments are layered in atavistic spiritualism and romantic idealism. However, much of what Tagore said is intellectually valid, and some of it is borne out by contemporary post-colonial criticism. Critics concurred that nation is a necessity. It has labored on behalf of modernity, and it helps to bolster the present civilization. As a political organization, it befits the social and intellectual milieu of present society. But they hardly claim its moral authority of its beneficial role in the reinforcement of human virtue. Critics also view the constructed aspect of nationalism as a weakness in the ideology. It is vulnerable to regressing into more natural social units of clan, tribe, and race, or language and religious groups. Its very formative process introduces a self-deconstructing logic in it. The process of formation or invention further makes it a potent site of power discourse. Although it is meant to stand for horizontal comradeship, exploitation and inequality remain a daily occurrence in its body, and the nation never speaks of the hopes and aspirations of its entire imagined community. In conceiving its overarching ideologies, it often places the dominant group at the center, pushing the minority population to the periphery. Thus, instead of a fraternity, it creates a new hierarchy and hegemony within its structure, and exposes a fracture between its rhetoric and reality. Tagore maintained that India's immediate problems were social and cultural, and not political. India is the world in miniature. This is where the races and religions have met. Therefore, she must constantly strive to resolve her burden of heterogeneity by evolving out of these warrings, contradictions, a great synthesis. First and foremost, India must address the caste issue. The caste system has become too rigid and taken a hypnotic hold on the mind of the people. What was once meant to introduce social order by accommodating the various racial groups of India has now become a gigantic system of cold-blooded repression. India ought to come out of this social stagnation by educating the people out of their trance. Only when the immovable walls of society were removed or made flexible will India regain her vitality and dynamism as a society and find true freedom. What is the purpose of political freedom when the elites in society are exploiting the lower classes, especially the untouchables, so ruthlessly?